perhaps we should ask for public comment at this time. What do you think, Dr. Phillips? Is that in order?
I think Dr. Winkleman's on her way down to the...
You saw a wink.
Oh, sorry. Hi, Dr. Elizabeth Winkleman with the California Psychological Association. Only if you're ready for me, though. I don't want to rush in. Okay. And by the way, I appreciate the clarification that you were just working on, and you brought up a wonderful point, Dr. Horn, and to clarify how an IO psychologist would be affected or not affected by this. So thank you for that. I wanted to thank the board again for working on developing these proposed regulations. It's such an important area. This is really of great concern to patients and psychologists in terms of facilitating the provision of psychological services via telehealth and letting people know how to do it the right way and wanting to be in compliance with all the rules and regulations about it. The one area that I still think is, and Dr. Phillips has mentioned it briefly initially, is still very unclear and I think potentially restrictive in a way that it's not intended to be, is the language in Section A relating to being a resident. I understand the intention of allowing residents who are in California and getting treatment to be able to be treated when they are temporarily away on business or vacation or such, and that absolutely makes sense clinically from both the patient and the psychologist perspective. However, I have two concerns with how this is being, the current wording as being unclear and potentially restrictive in an unintended manner. The first, which is that by referring to a residency status, this is different than the way that all of the other authorities and states have defined and addressed the issues regarding telehealth. Because all of the other authorities and states and also federal government document that I had forwarded, that I have mentioned previously, and I can give you the citation, have looked at the physical location of the patient when they're discussing telehealth services, not at the residency of the patient. So other laws and authorities have said, okay, we're going to look at where the patient is when you're providing the service and where the psychologist or other healthcare provider is when you're providing services. And you as the provider need to be in compliance with whatever rules there are about this, both in your state and in the state where the patient is physically located when they receive the services. So the first concern I have is that if we do a regulation that's based on a different issue, which is legal residence or residence as defined here, as opposed to the physical location of the patient when they're receiving services, that that's confusing and it's different from other regulatory bodies, including the Board of Behavioral Sciences here in California, which looks at their regulations, which you've included, look at the physical location of the psychologist and the patient, not at the residency. But more importantly than that, which is more technical, is what would the effect be in the situation such as Dr. Phillips mentioned, which does come up, where you might have a person come into California, and I do get questions about this. It definitely comes up, where say you live in the patient lives in New York, they come to California for college, say they're at UC Davis, they're getting treatment by a psychologist in Davis, they go home for vacation to New York, and this would imply that you can't talk to the patient. So instead of expanding it for that subset of patients, this would actually arguably be contracting the availability of telehealth services. And this happens also if somebody is, for example, has a job placement and they're temporarily here, say they got a 2-year position in Los Angeles and then they're going to go back to their home state in Colorado. For that 2 years, they might they would not be a legal resident, and then if they go home to Colorado, suddenly they can't talk to their California psychologist. So I think that's a problem. And then another situation that's a potential problem, but not as much of a concern, but one that I think is worth considering, is if I'm a psychologist here and I have a really great level of expertise in a very difficult, complex subject, say dissociative identity disorder. Let's say somebody in another state in Missouri, then there's no one there who works with dissociative identity disorder, and they do a bunch of research and they're working with their therapist and they say, I want to do a consultation with this national expert. Can I have some, video conferencing sessions with that person? I'm getting my psychotherapy here in Missouri, but I want to have some expert consultation with someone who really specializes in this area. Again, that would not be covered by this because the patient would not be a resident of California. So I'd be glad to. I know it's complicated, and I think that we are all talking about trying to address patient needs and clarify the expectations for psychologists in this really important area. But I think it's the language here. It has some potentially unintended consequences.
I appreciate those comments, Dr. Winkleman. You've obviously given a lot of thought to it. I am less concerned about whether our regulation is consistent with the language that's being used by other states, because I actually think the language around originating site and all that stuff, to me, gets very confusing. I think we do want to give clear guidelines to our licensees as to when they can and can't do it. And I guess really the policy question is, how broad are we, how permissive are we being about interjurisdictional practice, because that's what we're talking about is interjurisdictional practice. And I don't know, I'd be curious to hear what other board members think about it. I gave some thought to this after we spoke briefly yesterday, and I think there is a limit to how much we want to say we're allowing interjurisdictional practice when it is less about serving the residents of the state of California, and it's more about just being able to provide interjurisdictional services. That's the way I originally thought about it. I think things like that may almost be better addressed by something like Psych, although I'm not sure that Psych is we're ever going to become part of that pact. Then you're really just talking about pure interjurisdictional practice, and that starts to make me feel like maybe we're going beyond the metes and bounds of what we are to regulate, which is people that are in the state or people that are. But I do take your point very well in terms of continuity of care. If somebody was here, started services, needed to be temporarily, and they're not a permanent resident of the state of California, and they had to leave the state and wanted to speak to their therapist, we certainly wouldn't want them not to have continuity of care. So I'll be curious to hear what other board members have to say.
Maybe I could just add a quick comment. Also, thank you for your thoughtful input. I'm left with trying to sort out the reasons that we didn't go with where the patient is located like BBS did. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we wanted to express our belief that we owe something to existing patients that happen to be out of state in terms of continuity of care and preserving that treatment relationship. So that comes to my mind as one of the things that was in mind as we thought about this, looking for a way that we could try to support that, recognizing that we don't regulate what happens in other states, but wanting to express through this some clear intent that we expect and understand and hope that our providers would try to provide service to patients when they're out. Would you want to elaborate on that, Dr. Phillips?
There may be some way to draw language or to create language that would permit for the situation where somebody initiated the therapy in the state and then left the state. But I don't think we want to give our licensees permission to continue to just see a patient for
No.
an indefinite period of time
No.
if they've just left the state and they have no intention of coming back. But I think for purposes of continuity of care, I think we could do something around providing or permitting or facilitating continuity of care in situations where people have initiated the service in California, are temporarily out of state. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
I mean, I just want to interject here, and as a public board member, non-professional that one day may seek one of your professional help here, who has a time slot today at 6 o'clock. But in all seriousness, and because of continuity of care, and I guess my question is just as a consumer, right, and from an insurance coverage, are we talking about clarification here to get reimbursed for the services provided via telehealth? So if that's kind of what's within this context, then as I was trying to state earlier, our health insurance, for those of us that will be able to continue to keep it, we would, our health insurance follows us, correct? So if we're visiting here or if I'm temporarily in New York, my health insurance just covers and follows me. Is that not?
Well, I actually see that kind of as a separate question.
Okay.
And so from the patient perspective, what I think we're talking about is access to care to your therapist when you're out of town. Like, can they be in compliance with their licensing laws and regulations if they talk to you or provide a phone session when you're out of state? Whether the insurance will cover it or not is a separate question, and I don't think it's going to be able to be answered by this. But it's a hot topic. People are talking. I think there's some legislation that's pending, and so some insurance covers phone sessions and some does not, and that's both within California, because this covers a teletherapy within California too, because we're a gigantic state, So this also covers when I'm in Los Angeles and maybe my therapist is in San Francisco, or I'm on. So I see that as a separate question, and that it is one that we would all, I'm sure everyone in this room would be concerned about wanting to encourage and facilitate the insurance reimbursement, but it would not be addressed one way or another by this.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
I don't think that this regulation is going to be a venue where we can resolve that issue, because we've been given the ability to do some regulation around telehealth. I don't think insurance coverage around telehealth would be something that we would. So I think that's probably a different kettle of fish that also needs to be addressed, very definitely.
No, thank you, because it breaks it up in my head of where we're going with this, but thank you.
So I have a question about this, particularly about the first thing that Dr. Winkleman said. We have somebody here, they begin treatment here. I think you mentioned that, but they're here temporarily, maybe 4 years. They're going to school or something like that, and they're leaving. I think, I don't know if it would be, and that may be the way to talk about it. If treatment is begun in California, then we can follow them or something, even if they're away temporarily, even if they're not a resident of California. And I definitely think that's something that is within our ability to address. The other is, to me, about being, essentially serving as a consultant to using telepsychological means or telehealth means to somebody who's a resident outside of the state. To me, that's a little more complex. So I'm not sure if maybe there's some other ways that we might have available that can take care of it, because that seems more to me, it's not like general applied psychology, but it seems more to me a little bit along that sort of in that dimension in a way. It's not like it's ongoing. It's it's limited. You might be giving testimony somewhere. You might be doing a consultation somewhere. That seems a little bit different and maybe not to me, and not necessarily what we're trying to do here. So I see that as maybe not, we don't quite have the way to do that right now in this.
I guess to follow up on Dr. Horn's comment, that to me feels like purely interjurisdictional practice.
Yeah.
And I think at that point, it really becomes about the licensing law of where the patient is. I don't know that we should really weigh into that. I think that's going to be up to the state that's regulating the care for people that are residents of that state. So I would feel personally reluctant to wade into that area. I think then it becomes really incumbent on the person making sure that they can practice in that state.
If I may make another comment about this, is that any kind of interjurisdictional practice the person already does need, and it's in the draft rule, needs to be in compliance with the regulations in the other state.
Right.
And I think that anything that is not included in what your language is going to arguably be excluded. In other words, anything, if you say you can, if the regulation says you can do it if the patient initiated practice, the treatment here, and I do think that's the key group of people that we're talking about. I agree with you. That's and that would be fine.
Here. Yeah.
But I just wonder what others would think, or in terms of would that mean that something else that people might be currently doing is now excluded? Because you're saying if you want to, the regulation would be saying if you want to practice telepsychology, here's what you need to do. So it is possible that it would limit some people. I don't know how common that practice would be. I know the other situation is very common where people initiate treatment here and go out. I'm not sure how common the practice is of somebody providing consultation out of state, but I would say that it would arguably be now not okay if it is not, if the language is now made to just be you need to initiate the treatment here in California.
Part of my practice does involve consultation with people out of state, but typically who I consult with is not the patient. I consult with the healthcare provider in the other state. So I don't feel restricted by telehealth. I mean, I'm just being a consultant to another healthcare professional, and I think that's well within the scope of our license without having to say it. I actually don't know if I'd be comfortable with people, we'll use your example, consulting with somebody with, even if they got video feed and they can watch the changes in appearance and the changes in voice, doing dissociative identity disorder work, I don't know that it could really fall into any appropriate practice. But I do take what you're saying. I guess my primary concern here is about the person who initiates care here and being able to give them some measure of continuity of care. Historically, just anecdotally, for what it's worth, when I've had patients that have permanently moved out of state, even when they were California residents, eventually you reach a point, even if you've had some telephone follow-ups with them, where you say, you're really a permanent resident of the state of Massachusetts now, and I really want to help you find a provider there that can deal with you in a much more immediate way, because there are limits to telehealth.
I'd like to ask Dr. Winkleman a kind of a question. And I'm looking for a simple, good answer that addresses all of this. It may be a long look. What if we were to say something like, when it comes to telehealth, you've got to start with the person located in California. And if that person travels out of state, you can still see them. No specification for about how long, temporary, whatever, provided you comply with the jurisdictions, which are different everywhere, period.
Well,
That doesn't anticipate, maybe this is what you're going to say, Dr. Winkleman. That does not say, however, that you can do it within the state. And I think, in other words, we've also got to say that you've got to, because I do telehealth, but it's typically with California residents that move from like Los Angeles to San Diego, and they want the continuity of care, and they'll come see me when they're in town. So I think we want to cover that base as well.
So starts in California, continues in California.
Right. That's
And
still,
if they,
still telehealth.
if they're physically out of state, it continues unless that runs contrary to the regulations in the other jurisdiction.
It's kind of a simple solution, actually. I like it.
I don't know.
Well, I actually think that you could just simply, it's that you could certainly revise the language very simply, I think, by just taking out, first of all, that's what the Board of Behavioral Sciences did. If you look at the first and last paragraph of the Board of Behavioral Sciences regulations, which is in the booklet, it basically says you can do telepsychology with your patient who's in the state of California. It also says you can do it when they're not in California, as long as you're in compliance with that other state's law. So that's essentially what they are saying. And I think that if you simply deleted in that first paragraph A, instead of who is a resident of California who is temporarily located outside of the state, to just say who is located outside of the state. So you're saying you can provide psychological services within the state or outside of the state, as long as you comply with everything else that is the guidance provided in this proposed regulation. So I think there would be a potentially simple way to do this.
Yeah, I don't know if I would necessarily adopt the Board of Behavioral Sciences language. I actually find it confusing. It's drafted to be simple, but I think ultimately it ends up confusing me when I think about it. But I think there probably is a simple solution that we can come up with.
So possibly just reading, a licensee is permitted to provide psychological healthcare services via telehealth to an originating site in this state, as defined in 2290.5 of the code, and to provide psychological services to a patient or client who is located outside the state, subject to the laws and regulations of the other state, where either the licensee or patient is located. And then you could delete the rest of the
But
paragraph.
it doesn't say that the service has to be initiated in California.
You could add that, yes, if you wanted.
Because
want
this,
to-
to me, is like a license to do interjurisdictional practice, period, and I'm not sure that that's what the statute
That's thin
intended.
ice. I don't
Yeah, we're not
think we
doing
want to go there.
Okay.
I have drafted just something, and I'm just throwing spaghetti on the wall here, but after the definition of resident, I wrote, a licensee may also provide psychological health care services to a patient or client who has initiated services from a licensee who is temporarily located outside of this state. And that may cover.
Yeah,
So I was just trying to cover that person that, let's say they're a student at UC Davis, they go home for Christmas and they're in Boston. It was initiated here, the continuity of services would still continue when they're temporarily outside of the state. It would just be that it has to be initiated here in California with a California licensee.
It was a little confusing to me the way you said it, but I think if we said, like, who may not be a resident of California but has initiated, or resident in the state, but has initiated services with a licensed psychologist, within the state, blah, 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 something like that. Because
I'm very sympathetic to the desire to try to cover a lot of the variations on a theme. What I want to kind of throw out there is that this is not a prohibition. This doesn't say you can't do it unless. The statute is permissive, the regulation is permissive, and simply outlines the conditions under which the health can be given. My concern is if the board starts to try to define every variation on a theme, you're not going to be able to do that. And the more you try to do it, the more it looks like that means I can't do it if. So I offer that potentially saying what we know, what the board knows, which is that we're here, the board is here to protect the residents of California, and rather than trying to outline every variation on a theme, may accomplish more of what the board wants, but it's a policy call. I don't know if you, as Dr. Phillips has said, more than that, do we start looking like the board is trying to get into the business of regulating jurisdictional practice.
Don't want to do that.
Dr. Phillips, could I say one thing? I'm going to have to go. I apologize.
Oh, no problem.
I think, Ms. Marks, that's a good point. However, the other half of that coin is not just protecting residents of California, but it is giving guidance to your licensees about what they can do that the board has told them they can and cannot do. So I think there is a compelling reason to give guidance so that psychologists understand from the Board of Psychology. They're asking for this all the time. And I would just also go back to Dr. Horn's point earlier, and I'm just interested, maybe this is for further conversation. If I understand the challenge of writing regulations off a statute that is really written on a medical model and therefore doesn't really apply
Doesn't really anticipate.
to anticipate the broad range. So given that, if you do something like this, then what kind of guidance does the board intend to give to psychologists who are your licensees, who are also practicing psychology under their psychology license, but who do not provide healthcare services? Specifically, IO psychologists whose clients are organizations. And in fact, that is the group of people who probably need the guidance the most about using telepsychology, because they are practicing all over the world sometimes. So there is the consumer protection issue, of course, which is paramount, but then also you have a whole group of licensees that's really begging for guidance on what I can and cannot do. So I'm wondering how you can really avoid the idea of interjurisdictional practice in a way, because you know, if you're going to tell your licensees, what are they supposed to do if someone out of state wants to see them? That is it's a question, and unfortunately, you know, we know that regulations lag far behind reality, and so as more psychologists have extended practices that may include potential clients from all around the country, let's say, the question is, can I do that? I'm licensed. And that's why, going back to Dr. Winkleman's first point, that is why I think in most other guidelines and guidance, the term residence is not used, and they refer to the location of the patient and the physical location, and then having to comply with the rules and regulations of the physical location. So it's complicated, and I understand. I think I understand that you may be saying that you are going to try and address a narrow slice of this, but not perhaps address everything with this. I will just say that then there's going to be a big segment of your licensees that still don't know what kind of guidance the board is giving. So,
And I am
It's a challenge, I understand.
sympathetic to that. Unfortunately, we can only pass regulations based on what we've been given statutory authority to pass regulations on. And when I read that statute, it's a healthcare statute.
may I ask one more question? Can you give any kind of guidance that is not regulation?
It's a really interesting question. We've talked about guidelines before, having guidelines
Don't use
of the
that
board,
word,
but is
but-
that kind of quasi-regulation without a statutory
Is that
enactment?
possible to do that, or is that just not something you can do?
They're not enforceable.
Right, but could you do it anyway? Could you give guidance to your licensees that is something other than an enforceable regulation? It's just a thought.
I'd have to see kind of the example of it. In this particular case, I think what we're talking about is the guidance that still involves a caveat of this board cannot determine what happens in other states.
Right.
So
Well,
I'm not,
yeah.
I'm not sure how useful.
I almost think, from our point of view, we would do something similar to what we've done in the past, which I don't know that the licensees find effective, which is to say, we haven't passed regulations. We don't think we have authority to pass regulations in this area yet. But if you want guidance as to what your professional, your National Professional Association says, here's a link to
Well, we can do that.
Yeah, no, you can do that, but we could also.
We have done that. We do
We've
that.
done that. We've done that in the past as
Yeah.
well. I
Yeah.
just think we're a little hamstrung here.
Yeah.
I totally get what your concern is, but we're a little hamstrung in terms of whether we can do any kind of regulation in this area. And without, I think, a formal legal opinion that this allows us to also do non-healthcare related psychology, I'd be really reluctant to do that. I think what we probably need to do is to consider the question, perhaps after we pass these regulations, of what needs to be done in terms of advocacy or a legislative proposal.
Yes.
This might be something we'd want to add to our list of things we're going to talk, an hour with each legislator, please. Just so that we, I think it is something we do need to highlight, but I don't think it's something we can address now. And I think we have to be careful about giving guidelines, because it does sound like kind of something you should do, but are we even saying if you do all these things that, yeah, it's not binding, and it's not binding on the board in terms of a determination. So I
But to
think-
say things you should consider is different from guidelines, maybe. We could, well, I'm not saying it's enforceable. That's not what I'm saying, but I mean, people are asking for perhaps some sort of guidance, and I'm not saying to do it here. I mean, here I think this is really clear. This is about healthcare, and we can't think of every single thing that might come up, but I think particularly the thing is like if the sessions or healthcare are initiated here in California, if we add that here, to me, that feels like we are capturing people who are residents, people who may be here temporarily, but over an extended period of time. And, it seems to me like we are capturing those folks, that are essentially receiving their psychological health care here, in California, and we can follow them or do things with them, or, that to me is about what we can do with this. It's protective, but otherwise, I think we can say, here are things to consider, just like we were talking about social media. We're not going to necessarily have guidelines or create regulation, but we are going to say, think about this before you have a website.
I also don't
or
want
whatever.
to mislead licensees into believing if they think about those things, that they've covered all the bases and they wouldn't necessarily run afoul. So it's almost like I'd rather not say anything unless I can say something completely that they know they can rely on. But I certainly would be happy to refer them to other resources where they could see what they need to think about. And it's not, I don't want to put a board imprimatur on something, in my mind, for what it's worth, the board imprimatur on something that we haven't adopted as a policy of the board.
Well, that's fine. I mean, I think that's another issue and another thing. I mean,
Looks like the telepsychology committee will be going on after this.
Yeah,
Well,
we have a couple of more. Dr. Phillips, Ms. Sorik wants to make a comment, and I think Dr. Schaefer does. And if we're going to go back to another committee meeting,
She flinched.
that was a test question. I kind of just ran
I'm
that.
the twitch. I'm kidding.
So, Dr. Phillips, maybe you can help set the pace here, because you've got other business you want us to get to. And
Well, I certainly think we should take the other comments.
I'll be really quick, and then I know Ms. Burns has a quick comment as well. One thing to possibly consider, because I know, and not to open up another issue as part of this here, but in the last two board sunset reviews, the state legislature has asked about what this board is doing about telepsychology, not telehealth. And I don't know the background insofar as what they consider to be telehealth versus telepsychology, but something to have food for thought on that. So perhaps if you want to parse it out as this is the first step to consider and starting the rulemaking, and then have the committee reconvene and discuss the issue of telepsychology to address the other applied areas, that might be something to consider. I just wanted to throw that out.
Ms. Schaefer? Or Dr. Schaefer, I'm sorry. Mrs. and my doctors now.
That's okay. Just a couple of things. I'm glad that we're addressing these issues for one reason, that it's an ethical concern, I believe. So when we have a patient and they leave for college and what have you, there's a legal aspect that you're dealing with, but we need to avoid doing no harm, of course, and abandoning our client during those periods of time. And this has been something that's been kind of a hole in the fabric of guidance, so this is great. I'm wondering, though, why we are not moving towards, in the absence of the Psych compact being solidified, if that's the correct term for it, something that gives a little bit more of a global perspective for those that want to move forward with telepsychology. I like to use that term because I think it kind of covers the base, and it doesn't confuse the consumer to think that we are MDs versus PhD PsyDs. But why not have something, if it can't be put into this regulation somewhere, that says something to the extent that psychological services may be provided to those individuals seeking treatment outside of California by a licensed clinician in California, licensed psychologist in California. However, it's incumbent upon the licensed psychologist to ensure that they are in full compliance with the regulations of that external entity, the other state. Something that allows psychologists to move forward into this field when all the other fields are moving forward and we are still at the gate waiting to get a go.
Well,
So-
I'm going to disagree with you.
Can I just say
Oh, sure,
one
go
thing
ahead.
here? Right now, the way that we can practice psychology in another state is to get a license in that state. That is it. We can, most states, I think, allow temporary practice, but,
Not all of them.
huh?
Not all of
Not
them.
all of them. I said most states allow temporary practice, and, there are different rules depending on the state about how you can practice temporarily.
Right.
But there is nothing right now that allows us, other than those two ways,
Do you have
to practice.
any sense how the other disciplines are starting telehealth practices that are national telehealth? Have we investigated that as a board? Have you
Well, a lot of the
investigated
initial
It's a good
telehealth
question.
was happening within federal healthcare services. So like federal prisons, VAs, those types of things.
that? Yeah, those have been
They've
for a
got,
while,
they've got a
yeah.
free pass.
But they have,
get
they're under
exempted out of a
different,
lot
they're
of
under a
stuff.
different jurisdiction
Yeah,
than we are.
right.
However, I'm speaking about those telehealth companies that have come up.
Yes.
They're providing national mental health services being run by people with degrees in mental health. And if we don't know, maybe that, I mean, I myself would be willing, just for my own edification, to find out how is that happening, under what jurisdiction or what understandings have they been able to pull something together to do that? Or is it the Wild West show and people
It
are
is the
doing these
Wild,
things
it is the
without-
Wild West. It is the Wild
I
West.
think a lot of these people are
Yeah, this is
practicing
not-
illegally,
They're practicing
And no one's
illegally.
taken them to task,
That's
which
right.
is,
which
yeah.
maybe is another issue for us to look at in the telepsychology
But are we
community.
referring, though, to, I'm sorry to cut you
Subsequent
off,
to,
Dr. Phillips, but are we referring specifically, though, to psychiatrists that,
MFTs, psychiatrists, physicians.
because those fall under different disciplines, correct? And I think that's more applicable to rural areas where they really are limited, or for us here in California, limitations with psychiatrists or,
Yes, that's
The
a-
number,
the,
right.
the, what you're speaking of is another issue separate from this, which is
Oh.
access to care issues and the mandate for that and why it's needed. But I'm speaking about burgeoning areas of business, and we as psychologists, look for where can we move in next to where other disciplines are, and how do we become players in these arenas? How do we create job opportunities for students coming out of school with other areas of mental health kind of dwindling, and so I would like to see our field not be the last ones out the gate, so to speak, and if, as a board, if there's some way for us to move that forward in even some small, gentle way, that might be helpful.
And to not hamstring ourselves with regulations that may make it difficult to expand, as Dr. Winkleman was saying.
Exactly. I was thinking of the healthcare issue, and even, we keep speaking about IO as if they're separate, and having done some IO work as well over the years. IO psychologists give psychological testing to people, different various types. And when you do executive coaching, there's a fine line of moving the words around in terms of therapy versus coaching, and working with work groups and doing interventions and such, and critical instant debriefings in the workplace. So it's kind of fuzzy there too, I think, a little bit, and so maybe there's a way to think about addressing that, because I think your point was well taken. I won't take up any more time because I know you have a pressing agenda. Thank you.
Thanks.
Ms. Burns? Ms. Burns?
Let me just consult this. Oh, Sharisa. Go ahead, Sharisa.
I was really just hoping to see if we could capture the initiate services in this state or who as just inserted into A to cover our basis, if that helps, because I was just trying to get somewhere with the language to see if we're advancing this, but.
Believe me, as a committee member of long-standing off and on, I would love to see that too. I just want to make sure that we're.
Yeah, I just didn't know
giving
if
adequate
helping add that language into A right after, and to provide psychological services to a patient or client who initiates services in this state or who is a resident of California, and continues on. Does that capture some of the many needs?
Oh, I like that.
Does for me.
It's somewhat simple. It doesn't put it at the end. It
I
puts
like
it
it.
right in the middle. It's you're either providing it in California, it was initiated in California, or it's a resident who's temporarily outside. And if that helps clarify and gets us moving on so that we can also expand to those other fields to get to these other pressing issues that we need to get to. Because I know part of the rulemaking process is going to be the public comment and getting public input and fleshing all of this out. So
I personally very much like the language that you just used.
Could you repeat it?
absolutely. So if you want to start at the comma on the second one where it says of the code, and then go, and to provide psychological services to a patient or client who initiates services in this state or who is a resident of California who is temporarily located outside of this state. And then continue, just carrying on.
I think that
I think it covers
the areas that we're comfortable. And I know that
Exactly.
there are other areas that
We're
Dr.
not
Winkleman has
approaching.
raised. I also want to say, I think this board is very sympathetic to helping move psychology forward in a way that'll better provide access for consumers to services. But we have to be cognizant of what our license is in terms of regulation, what we're licensed to regulate, or what we're permitted to regulate, and I don't.
Well put.
So I think that some of what we're talking about are things that will ultimately probably move their way into policy and advocacy. But I understand what you were addressing, Dr. Schaefer, and I'm very sympathetic to it. And I would say, and I don't say this as a particular criticism of the California Psychological Association, I might say it as to our national association, that sometimes it feels like things are so long in coming, but I'm sure that people feel that same way when they look at the Board of Psychology. So I know it's a frustrating process for people. I think just a more general comment, one of the things that we're looking at here, I'll finish in a second, don't worry. I can hear him muttering over there. One of the things we suffer from is I think that psychology is one of the most principled professions. I think we take ethics more seriously than most professions. I think we tend to have, in my jargon, we have overdeveloped superegos or consciences. We tend to feel guilty about things we shouldn't feel guilty about. We tend to approach our licensing board like they're going to take they're going to put them in timeout. And I think it's part of the nature of being psychologists that we are very cautious to do things for fear that they are going to hurt patients. And I think we give more consideration to that, so I think it's also a plus for the profession. I have more respect, honestly, for this board, and I'm on it, so why not? But than I do some of the other boards, and who I think sometimes are fairly, and I'm not going to point to any particular board, and this isn't necessarily even related to BPS, but who are very cavalier about the ethical prescriptions, and it is, I feel like their licensees sometimes are running in the wild, wild west. And I'm sure we can all imagine one board or another that I'm talking about. But I think it's just consistent with the culture of psychology, for good or for bad.
I'm just not entirely sure Ms. Burns' language adds what I think the intent is to add, because if the person is here in the state, you can provide telehealth services within the state. I don't think there's any question about that. I'm not sure it really addresses what happens when that person temporarily in the state leaves the state, which is, I think, what the concern was. I want to throw out there that I think we've discussed before that this is not a type of service. This is just a mode of delivering services.
Yes.
And I'm not sure that this is this is necessarily the time to try to define all of the, every variation. I think the idea was to initially give some guidance, as Dr. Linda Crow wants. I don't know that it's all of the guidance, because I don't know that we can foresee every variation on the theme, but at least provide some guidance as to what a licensee should be looking at when they're providing, delivering services through this mode. I can appreciate the fact that there are going to still be questions out there. I don't know that you're going to be able to, at this time, answer all of those questions.
For example, I think the kind of guidance, and there could be a long list. One item might be for psychologists, if you're planning to provide service out of state, you should know that the regulations in that state prevail. A lot of people might not think about that, and that's the kind of one of many things that I think we could tell people to start thinking about as they do telehealth.
I actually think the regulation does do that adequately. I turned it on and off at the same time. I do think that the regulation adequately addresses that for our purposes, in the sense that it says that you have to refer to the laws and regulations of the state
yes.
within which the person's located. I don't think we can do any more with that right now. Is there alternative language that you wanted to propose?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
No.
Even if you could reflect, that's my question I was going to ask. If, based on what has been said, could we take that and could we take that and begin to work with that in a way that would?
I think the area that I might suggest, if you want to continue to look at that language, is to determine whether or not you're really addressing, because it's a delivery, mode of delivery, and whether or not you want to address all of your licensees, no matter what kind of services they're delivering, you want to address the mode of delivery. So that would mean, do you want to be more explicit about including psychologists who are providing non-health services, and again, that's the policy call.
Too cumbersome.
But with respect to the issue of whether somebody's here temporarily and then they've gone back home, I think I would offer something along the lines of what Dr. Phillips said, is how long are we saying you can follow someone around the country? And I think that does get more into the interjurisdictional nature of services, rather than we really simply want to look at conditions right now for delivering services through a particular mode of delivery. As simplistic as that might be, I just wonder if that's what we've got right now.
May I ask a question? Just ask this question. If we were to define temporary, would that help? Could that help? And would that kind of keep us out of interjurisdictional areas?
I kind of think we shouldn't, because our license is only temporary in very different degrees, state by state. Some it's a few days, some it's a month. So we'd have to keep that in mind, and if we try to talk about temporary in terms of the service itself rather than where it occurs, I think we're going to get in trouble.
I was thinking about the mode of the
I think
delivery
all we
service.
want to add here, if I heard us at this point in time, is just to account for that person or those people who are here temporarily, but have initiated services here. So it's temporarily, they're not residents of California, but they're going to school in California, or they've been moved here for a job for a year or two or something like that. And if they go on vacation somewhere or, visit someone somewhere and they want to continue access, or they have an emergency or something like that, that's what I think what we're talking about. To me, it's like part of a sentence here. We've talked about people who live here, who are gone or residents here who have gone temporarily. We've talked about people who live here but are, people who are residents here. It says resident means any individual who's present in California for other than a temporary or transitory purpose, or who is domiciled but outside California for a temporary purpose. And really, we're talking about people who might also be, if we say domiciled in California but outside, do we mean people who may be residents somewhere else, but if we say domiciled, are we saying they are living here for, what are we saying? What does that mean?
It's defined in that last
It means
sentence.
a place where an individual voluntarily establishes himself and their family, not merely for a special or limited, no. So maybe we want something else, because we do want to talk about, I think the only thing we want to add is that people who are here for, again, they're here temporarily, but it might be for an extended temporary time period, and they begin treatment here and then are gone for brief periods of time and come back.
To see if I could
That's what we want to add.
I'd like to try to respond just a little bit to that. I'm sort of tilting back in the direction of physical location, and since we don't want to encourage interjurisdictional, I think, practice, we could say that the telehealth has to initiate in California. And I'm thinking it doesn't matter whether you're just visiting for a holiday. You could get in-office service if you're here for a holiday. Why not telehealth service in California if it's initiated if you're located in California? And then we could say if you're traveling out of state, it has to conform rather with the regulations of the other jurisdiction. And I think we may get into a muddle if we talk about temporary or domiciled. It's just, if you start here, then we can continue with you out of state, but we don't want people to, I think there are some people that want to advertise and do telehealth all over the world, and I don't think we should encourage that through this regulation.
I have a clarifying question for Ms. Marks. Perhaps we've heard the concern that if there is services that are initiated in California and that person temporarily goes outside of the state for a short period of time, does this language prohibit that? I think that's the main concern here. If the answer is no, then maybe this is not an issue. If the answer is yes, what language do we need to add to capture those people so there's continuity of service?
Yeah. I don't think it prohibits it. As I said, this is more of a permissive, this is what the board is saying the conditions are for providing services through this mode. So if you want to talk about more specifically, you want to be clear that somebody who's here temporarily and then leaves temporarily, only to come back temporarily, I don't know that it's prohibited. I think that gets a little closer to trying to regulate interjurisdictional practice. And that's my point.
So if a student, in that situation, there was someone that was a resident of Boston, they came to college for 4 years, they initiated mental health services here in California with a California licensee, that would be prohibited in this language for their therapist to call them if they went home for Christmas, but they're in California for 4 years.
No, I don't think it's prohibited.
Okay.
Again, this is not proscriptive. This is permissive of the board setting the conditions, particular conditions around delivering particular services in a particular way. I don't know that it does not address every variation on a theme, and I think the danger of trying to do that does get more into interjurisdictional practice. It's up to the board. I don't know whether or not, again, it's how much of it you want to address. Do you want to say the person is here temporarily, but then leaves temporarily, but they're going to come back because they've only completed 1 year of school. They're going to come. So I don't know how much the board wants to sort of place around that. The more you do that, the more it becomes, in my opinion, it becomes prescriptive on things you haven't defined.
Right.
This is really about those conditions, about holding a license, obtaining consent, et cetera, in particular circumstances that the board feels it has the jurisdiction over. It's the people who live in California, who may be traveling outside, but that's still going to potentially be subject to the laws of the other jurisdiction, and people who are here. I mean, there's, in Dr. Phillips' example of people who were from LA, then moved to San Diego, there's no issue there. I mean, you're still inside the state, so I don't think that's an issue. And everything else, you can try to define it, but again, the more you start listing things, the more the things you haven't listed look like you meant to exclude them. So I think that's the danger.
So if we said resident means any individual who's present in California, and don't say for other than a temporary or transitory purpose, would that be?
My internal lawyer listens at that only in the
Okay.
sense that this is a term of art that's used in other statutes.
Okay, because the way I read this, it doesn't, and maybe I'm reading it wrong, because what I'm hearing you say is like this, it would be permitted if somebody were here in college and they went home.
It's not prohibited.
It's not prohibited.
It's not prohibited.
But the way I read it, it is prohibited, so I might be, because it says resident, yeah, or domicile, meaning that they are planning to be permanent residents. And that's how I'm reading it, so I might be reading it wrong, but.
What do we lose if we go, my suggestion earlier, that if you're located in California, you have to be located here to start telehealth. And if you leave, you can try to continue to get service as long as it doesn't collide or not conform with the other jurisdiction. We don't have to define residency or domiciled or temporary.
I liked your word initiated in California.
Then we get back more toward the language that was originally used, and I can see the logic of that. Here's my concern. My concern is this 440. We have not taken a restroom break, and I want to be honest, and this is not a criticism of anybody, this conversation is feeling less and less productive to me. It feels like we're wondering more and more.
So what are we going to do, though? I mean, are we going to make, or does it go back to the Telepsych committee?
And as a member of the Telepsych committee, I object to it, but yeah.
But before,
I think it goes back
That's
to
fine.
committee.
That's
before we
fine.
do that and before we break, may we consider Ms. Burns' language after break or whatever we're going to do?
I actually don't think that's going to be, and I don't, even if you want to hear the language again, I'm happy to have her read
I
it.
don't want to hear it again, but I'm just saying,
I
can somehow.
think
put that
it's
in
raised
there,
other
something.
issues that we have yet to discuss, and I think really the committee needs to discuss and resolve these issues. I know staff is very anxious to move ahead with this rulemaking package, in part out of deference to Dr. Erickson and how long he's been trying to get some regulations done in terms of
That's okay.
telepsychology.
That's okay.
But I think, and in part, because the staff is probably sick of seeing us talk about this stuff. But I think the bottom line is, if we're going to do it, we might as well do it right. And there's been enough things raised that I think it'd be useful to have another committee meeting. Grimace.
I agree, and I think we should do that. I'm apologetic to staff and whatever that we're at this point, but I think we can do a better job if we meet further.
And since we are taking a different approach to this, and it's an approach that's different than other boards have taken and such, I think we do have to fully conceptualize what we're doing in order to be able to do it. And I think it's been a very productive conversation in bringing up things that we had not necessarily anticipated. So, thank you.
That's the end of my report.
So do we have to move for it to go back, or does it just go back, or
I think it
what?
just goes back.
Yep.
Okay.
I do think we haven't had a restroom break in a million years. I want to get. Oh, sorry. We haven't had a restroom break. That's the most important thing to me. We haven't had a restroom break in a while, so let's go ahead and take a 5-minute restroom break, and then we're going to come back, and there's a very short amount of stuff still on the agenda. And we can move through it very quickly. We have the licensing report from our soon-to-depart Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson?
I can make this very brief. Ms. Sorek had talked about this earlier in her executive officer report about all the staffing changes that we've had recently. I just want to expand. We had a licensing analyst, Audrey Watkins, who left us for a promotional position, and she's very much missed. She was a good licensing analyst and helped us keep our timelines down. If you'll notice that our timelines are a little bit up, and I think it's just with the staffing changes and issues. I foresee once we're fully staffed by the beginning of next month, those should come back down to our 2 weeks that we like to keep it at. It's about 3 weeks, pushing up to 4 weeks now to process a new application. So Ms. Watkins is going to be very much missed, but we are happy for her getting a promotion to another department. And then Stephanie Chung, she's our new licensing manager, and we're so happy to have her. She brings a lot of experience in policy, and so I think that's going to be a big help to us when we're going through our pathways. And a lot of that's going to be coming down next year, or the following year. So welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Ms. Johnson has announced her retirement, which we're going to miss her a lot. And then I have to read this because I feel this is such a compliment and it will be a nice send-off for her. I'm just going to read from the memo. Ms. Johnson, her last day with the Board of Psychology will be on December 16 this year. She has been a state employee since 1979 and with the Board of Psychology since 92. Over the years, Ms. Johnson has repeatedly demonstrated passion, commitment, and dedication through her work at the board. She has been the lead in numerous projects and made tremendous impact to the licensing unit. Ms. Johnson will be greatly missed, and we wish her happiness, success, and good health as you begin your new adventure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Did Ms. Johnson write that?
Yeah. Oh, no.
Let's do that.
Now she's going to embarrass me. Thank you so much. Thank you. So I was like 2 years old when I started. Thank you. It has been such a pleasure to work for the Board of Psychology for 25 years. I just really respect this profession, and it's just all the board members I worked for. It has just been wonderful all these years, and I'm going to miss everybody very, very much. I'll have to peek in on the board meetings to come and see how everything's going. Look at licensing with the pathways. Let's see if you finish. So thank you for the kind words. That was very sweet. So now I have to go on with my report. Okay, let me get my composure. As I mentioned, we're about 3 weeks out now in the processing of brand new applications. Our retired annuitants, Kelly Okuma and Mary Lynn, are very good about keeping the psych assistants down. They're able to keep those within just a few days of receipt. And that's crucial, I think, for these psych assistants because they're waiting to work. They already have their employment. So we try to get those done as soon as they get into the office, and they've been really good about doing that. And like I said, once we're fully staffed, we have our new analyst starting, what day? When does Sharon start? Is it, I don't know what day.
She's starting at 28th of November.
Oh, okay. So, and then Chris Seabird is moving into Audrey Watkins' full-time or permanent position. So we should have we'll be fully staffed with the licensing analysts, and that should bring everything down on the timelines. And let me see. On the next page, it's just the data on how many licensees we have in California. It's just a snapshot of October 19th, how many licensed psychologists that are current and active for this fiscal year. And then we just have the historical data there as well. And then how many psych assistants and registered psychologists we have currently. So that's just a snapshot to give you an idea of the population right now. The 72-month limitation for psych assistant registrations, we're still trying to get the word out about the new Genesis date, the start date of the 72 months being October 23rd, 2011. We're getting lots of phone calls from people going, okay, now when is my end date? And trying to explain that to them. Most people are relieved a little bit that they've been given a little bit more time to prepare. But I think we're getting that word out. We have a notice on our website. Pathways to licensure, we're going to be continuing the review, hopefully completing the review with the licensing committee next on January. And then from there, it will go to a licensing committee with stakeholder invitation. That will be facilitated by our solid unit, and to get the stakeholders' input on the recommended changes. So hopefully that'll be sometime in the spring is the goal. And then to bring it all back to the board for a look at the final recommended changes in August, I believe, is the goal. Maybe. It can be done, I know. And that's about it on just that. We have several different little reports here for you. Here's just some status, just the number of licensing population, just how many are current and active, how many have been canceled, that just information for you. If you have any questions, just let me know. The next report is just how many applications we've received so far this fiscal year, and psych assistants and registered psychologists and licensed psychologist applications, and it goes up and down depending on the month. Some months are heavier than others, like June and July, because we have people graduating and going into internships and whatnot. So then you've got your examination statistics. If there's any questions on that, very similar, nothing really has changed on that. The next one, the performance measures. This is a new report for you all. It's these performance measures, what they do is they measure how long it takes the licensing analyst to process an application. So it doesn't count how long it takes an applicant to go through the exam process, to pass the exams and all. It's just how long it takes us from the time we receive an application to begin processing it, or how long it takes us to issue a license once they've completed, passed the exams and paid their fees. So it really just takes into accountability how long staff is taking to process. And I think our stats are pretty good. And these are days, yeah. This is since this is a new report, there are some variables, some stats that we were unable to fix with the legacy into Breeze. So they're a little skewed a little bit, but I still think they're pretty accurate in how long it takes us to process. And that's pretty good. The final report here is our satisfaction surveys for the fiscal year 15-16. And looking pretty good, I think. I think this reflects keeping our timelines down, trying to get back to phone calls and emails as soon as we can. We're trying to be conscious of all of those requests and phone calls and people wanting to get answers from us. And I think these survey results reflect our consumer services that we're trying to provide to our applicants and our licensees and the public. And if you look at number 13 on page 3, which is just the overall experience that they've had with the board, 41% are excellent in these responses. So that's great to see. I did bring all of the surveys, the 238 we received. If you're interested in looking at the comments, whenever we receive a positive or a negative comment about any of the staff, management does read that, and those good comments get into their personnel files, and we have quite a few. It's really nice to see, and it's nice to get appreciated by some of your applicants and all. So if you're interested in reading some of these, Dr. Horn has asked that the next time we do this report that maybe we do a synopsis of all of those comments so you can kind of read through them, and so we'll have that for you next time. But if anybody's interested, I did bring them. It was over there. It's in the box. If you want to take them and look at them, or I can do a synopsis and provide that to you if you'd like me to as well. But otherwise, Stephanie, do you have anything to add?
I have a question. Excellent
Yes.
report. Thank you. And of course, thank you for all of your excellent work
thank you.
in the last 25 years. You'll be very much missed. A question that I have,
Yes.
has anyone talked about why we have fewer psychologists in recent years that are licensed in a state where the population is growing?
Oh, I don't know how to quite answer that.
It's just a general thing to think about in terms of outreach and access and the profession in general. And I just wondered if there were thoughts that have been mentioned at the staff level. Okay.
Not really.
All right.
I don't know.
I have a quick question, and also thank you for yours. I just got to meet you, and you're
I know, and then I'm leaving.
I do hope you found your earring from that one day.
No, I never did.
Oh, okay.
I know. Hi, I'm Karen. I lost my earring.
Right, pretty much.
Yeah.
On just this question number 10, and thank you, and this for me, like I said, says a lot. I mean, it's so quick for me to, continue to catch up to speed on things, but you said you had, well, here's my question, though. On the number 10, U.S. mail, that's really hot. You guys get in the mail, people still physically
Yes.
mail things. Do we ever lose things, like, along the process?
They think we do. No.
Oh, that's...
No, we don't. No. I don't believe we do. But it's
Oh,
hard to know unless they contact us and said, I mailed that in.
Just if
But-
you ever heard, get that kind of feedback. But that's impressive. I mean,
Yeah.
that stuff still comes through the mail.
A lot of our
And we've
applications-
really encouraged licensees and registrants to use the online capacity. It's much faster for everybody concerned. They get a much more rapid response, but
Yeah.
it's taking a while for that message to catch, it seems.
It's growing. Where more and more applications are received online. We're seeing it's only been what, 2 year, going on 2 years since we've, 2 years that,
October 13th?
yeah,
Yeah.
that we've had the online application, and I think it's over 50% now, I believe.
Oh, is it?
That are doing the online, and it'll be more and more. I think as people realize that they can do it that way, then they can pay the fee with a credit card. It's just so much easier for the applicants to do it that way. But a lot of them still like the paper and downloading the application and mailing them into us, so we receive them both ways.
For the benefit of people that are watching on the webcast or watch this at a subsequent point in time, since I think there are no members of the public here other than staff, which is not, you're not really members of the public. I got my registration renewed in 2 days when I did it online.
Mm-hmm.
If you mail it in, it's got to get processed, it's got to go through the mailroom, it's got to get sorted, it's got to be given to the
Yeah.
correct analyst. It is really a cumbersome process.
Yes.
It slows the process down for the licensee. So if they're interested in getting the thing accomplished as quickly as possible, they're much better off doing it online, and I think it's more efficient for staff.
It is, and you talked about the payment part of it as well. If someone mails in their check with their application, it'll take almost 2 weeks for our cashiering unit to process their payment. That slows down our timelines, whereas they apply online, it's, the fee is processed right away, right when they're doing that, so we could get to the application quicker.
May I
That's great.
just say this regarding the mail process? It shows that somehow you all are connecting with the applicants in a way that you get this done and they feel comfortable, although the process might be longer and cumbersome and all of that. But still, you all have that inviting way of just making them feel secure about
Yeah.
that. And I appreciate that. I really do.
I
Well
think
done.
both ways, whether they send them in or do it
Exactly.
online, we try to make that connection with our
Yeah.
applicants.
Love it.
They're assigned their analyst. That analyst takes them through the whole process to licensure so that applicant knows who to contact and to get any questions
So they
answered.
call a person and
We send by email the initial update. Usually the communication is through email. But we do get lots of phone calls every day, and we try to be very cognizant of responding to all of our applicants and the consumers as quickly as possible.
Well, thank you both for the report, and best wishes to Karen, and we'll see you around, I hope.
Yes.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
Can I just, in response to your question about why are we having less psychologists, I mean, it's not that much less, but this is a national trend. The education for psychologists, I think we've had that number before. They may graduate with like $200,000 in debt.
Or
And
more.
it's not, and it's not one of the higher paid professions, so this is a national trend, just kind of seeing some, backing up, so.
Sounds like a good article, Dr. Erickson.
Oh! Write it down. You walked right into that one. Continuing education report, Ms. Everhart?
Yes, that's me. Hello, good evening. Okay, so this is for informational purposes only. There are 5 reports included. The first is the CE audits. That's from January of last year up until February this year. And the reason I'm encompassing last year is because I just started on 2016, so I wanted to provide the full view before I start over with 2016. Also included the audit overview, pass versus fail, the reasons for not passing the CE audit. This only encompasses January through December of 2015 because January and February 2016 audits are not completed, so I didn't want to provide stats on something that wasn't finished yet. Then I have citations issued and psychologist and psychological assistant renewal applications processed from January up until October 2016. So, like I said, this item is for informational purposes only. I think some things to highlight would be the number of audits that have been, I'm sorry, I'm tired. Total number of licensees selected for audit, 972, so from January up until February of this year. The total number that have actually been audited are 885. So there is a disconnect right there because, like I said, I'm not done with January and February yet. On the second report, the CE audit overview, pass versus fail, you could see that more people are passing versus failing, which is great. It's always good. So 87% versus 13. And then on the next report, attachment C, reasons for not passing the CE audit, you can see that the most common reason is that people are just short hours. So a lot of times that just means that they miscalculated or they just didn't get them. Citations issued for CE deficiencies. This is a snapshot from January 30th, 2016 to October 27th. So 16 total issued. So far, 13 have been resolved, and 3 were just waiting for them to either submit payment or to submit their CE that they were deficient in. And then the last report, this is as of October 27th, 2016. It captures all of the processed renewal applications for psychologists, both active and inactive, and then psych assistant applications as well. Or not applications, but renewal applications. And that is all.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Like those graphics.
Thank you. Color is good for you? Good.
I
Okay.
always like a good pie chart. Venn diagrams are nice, too. And our final item, other than asking for future agenda items, is the Licensing Committee report. Dr. Horn?
So I just want to add here at the very end here how much I personally appreciate Ms. Johnson and, what a great job you've done in turning the whole licensing process around from, in the last couple of years. And so I'm going to miss you a lot. And you've just been great. And, I hear this a lot from people who've called in and I've given them your name and direct number, but they always find you very helpful. So,
You're the one.
And I do want to thank the licensing staff because there's been a lot of work in the licensing committee, particularly over the last year too. So I just want to thank them for this. But let's start with A here, the discussion of requests for extension to accrue continuing education and exemptions to the CE requirements. So basically, we had asked staff to take a look at this. If this was a way, to look at this issue. Did we want to give this to staff? Did we want to give people a way to did we want to broaden the reasons that people could have, extend their time or get an exemption from continuing education? And the staff did this research, a list of pros and cons about the good things about it and the potential downsides of it. And ultimately, the licensing committee said that there are more downsides than positive sides, and we really didn't want to ultimately give a message that this was sort of a way around the requirements and stuff like that. So we felt comfortable and satisfied with the way things were. So this is just information for the rest of the board at this point in time. Next thing that let me find my agenda here. Statutory language for suicide risk assessment, and we've already talked about this in the legislation committee, so I'll just move on from that. And then really I'm going to say the last two things, C and D, but I'll start with C. So this is the pathways to licensure. We're still finding our way in those pathways. We're looking for all the paths we can and illuminating them. So we will be perhaps finishing the pathways discussion in January. It's going to be a 2-day meeting. One of the days is going to be devoted to pathways changes, and the next day will be devoted to the continuing professional development changes, changing from CE to CPD, and that's item D. We're still in the middle of those, so we don't really have anything new to report, but I think the January meeting's the 17th and 18th, is that it, or 18th and, I'm sorry? 26th and 27th? So I would like to tell people who might be listening in the public, it's still not the time for you to send in your comments. But we are going to be discussing these two things, CPD and pathways to licensure, at our January meeting. We really want to invite you to take a look. I'm sure we're going to be webcasting it like we do this because they are all-day meetings, and we know there's a lot of interest, so hopefully y'all will listen in and listen to the changes that we're making. And I think
One quick thing,
Yeah.
sorry. I don't think we have, I'm looking at our videographer here today. I don't think we have a videographer for that meeting because they were booked for other boards for those 2 days, unfortunately.
so it won't be webcast?
January 26th and 27th. I just didn't want to put out
Okay.
something that wasn't going to be available, but we will set up a teleconference so that people will have the ability to listen in and participate in the conversation. I
And in-
apologize for that.
That's okay. Actually, in some ways, that might be better because people can participate, and when they're webcast, they're not able to, so,
I just wanted to give a slight reframe to Dr. Horn's comment about providing public comment. Clearly, that's always permitted and invited. But I think what you were saying is that there's going to
The
be the
official comment,
stakeholder
yeah.
meeting, that
That's
there will,
right.
that's still yet to be.
Well, we'll have a
scheduled.
stakeholder meeting, but what I was saying is we don't have any regulations yet. And that's really what I was commenting on and saying not to have comments because, of course, public participation is always welcome and comments are always welcome. But in terms of official sending anything out for comment, that's what I was talking about. Still not, now is not the time for that.
And people had been sending in comments to the board and to the licensing committee and to staff that were based on a package that's no longer in existence. So it's really important that they give us the time to formulate it so that we can address concerns they previously raised, and then they can take a look at it. They can take a look at it at any time, but then they'll be able to take a look at it and really meaningfully comment on what
Right.
we actually are proposing. But as Ms. Marks says, they can comment, public comments available at any time.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for that correction. And that's it for the licensing committee report. And so I just am submitting that for what? Okay. So,
I move that the licenses committee report be accepted by the full board.
Second.
Ms. Burns. For the final time for this meeting.
That's okay.
You can just look at us.
Quibidoo,
Yes.
Erickson,
Yes.
Bernal,
Aye.
Horn,
aye.
Phillips.
Aye.
Passes.
3-2.
No, I think I'm correct in saying that is the end of our formal agenda for this meeting. Thank you so much for, yeah, I know, it's kind of a marathon, huh? Yeah, I'm going to do that in a second. I just wanted to thank everybody for their hard work, whether it's Dr. Horn for all the work she's doing on licensing committee, which has been, so much of it's done outside the public eye, but it's been a remarkable feat. You have more stamina than the rest of us put together, I think. For Dr. Erickson for being so patient about telepsychology when he's worked so hard on it for so long, but so that we can really get it right. And to all the staff that was here today and wasn't here today, just to thank them for all their efforts on behalf of the board. With that in mind, are there any recommendations for agenda items for future board meetings? Hearing none.
Oh, before,
Don't we hear what we have?
Oh, with the list.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I just have
Wishful thinking.
I just have a few items. So for, let's see here. Okay, so for the February 2017 board meeting, Antoinette and Miss Oric and Miss Monterrubio, we're going to work with each other to come up with an appropriate agenda item regarding the policies around enforcement, regarding mail ballots and so forth, and then present that to Dr. Horn. Ms. Jones had asked if Solid could provide information on how user-friendly the newsletter is on the board's website, in terms of accessing it, what type of file is used, and then just that we're going to schedule another telepsychology committee meeting and address the questions that were raised here today.
So I think that agenda item is something like the board's involvement in the enforcement process, particularly around balloting and discussion and so on and so forth.
It was looking at the policy for mail ballot policy.
Right.
That's what it was. Yes, thanks.
Okay. So any recommendations for other agenda items for future board meetings? Have I forgotten anything? Okay, then. The meeting's adjourned. Thank you.